All right, continuing with the notes. Inverse sine would be sine exponent -1. Remember, that doesn't mean reciprocal. That's the inverse notation. And a different way to write inverse sine is arc sine. So that means inverse. It's just a notation. And so notation, this just means inverse cosine. This means inverse tangent. And it could also be written arc cosine and arc tangent. All right, and then domain and range. So my inverse sine has domain that matches the range of the parent function sine. And the range of inverse sine is the domain of the parent function sine. And likewise for cosine and tangent. So the domain of inverse cosine is going to be -1 to 1. It comes from here, the range of cosine. And the range of the inverse function is the same as the domain of cosine. Likewise for tangent, the domain of inverse tangent is the same as the range of tangent, and the range of inverse tangent is the same as the domain. And notice that these are curved brackets not included because remember the parent function had asymptotes there. All right, so moving on. So that's our restricted domain. We're not graphing the inverse functions. We're just using the fact that it is an inverse function. Here's our other notation again, arc sine, arc cosine, arc tangent. So we're going to evaluate each of the following. So this says inverse sine of 1/2. So what that means is, I'm going to write it out once, and in the future I'm going to talk about it. So this means the sine of what number, this is our unknown, is equal to 1/2. So I'm going to pull out my handy dandy unit circle, which we have memorized, but we're going to quick look at it. And what I'm looking for is what x value, so angle, gives me a sine that's 1/2. But I'm also remembering that I'm in my restricted domain. So the restricted domain for sine is between pi/2 and -pi/2. So for sine, that's in this region. This is +pi/2. This is -pi/2 down here. So it's 3pi/2 if I go the positive direction. But if I'm in the negative direction, it's -pi/2. So I have to pick an angle in this region where the sine is 1/2. And remember, sine is the y coordinate. So cosine sine, that's negative. So I'm getting closer. Cosine sine, aha, here it is. So the sine is 1/2 at the angle pi/6. So it's pi/6. All right, let's look at this one. So now I want to know sine of what angle gives me -1/2 and in my restricted domain. So I'm in these angles. So my sine is -1/2 here. Now it's marked at 11pi/6, but remember we're only doing between +pi/2 and -pi/2. So this is -pi/6. So -pi/6. Now 3/2. So remember the domain of inverse sine is between -1 and 1. 3/2 is outside of that domain. So it's not in the domain and it doesn't have a solution. Let's see if I can finish this too. So now I have the cancellation property. The inverse of a function and a function should cancel, meaning sine inverse of sine is x. They undo each other, but only within the restricted domain. So we have to, before we go, yep, we know what it is, we have to check and see if this value is in the restricted domain. So that would be the range of inverse sine. So is pi/3 in the range of inverse sine? I'm going to pause the video.